First of all, welcome to the International Republican Institute and to the fifth installment of our Democratic Governance Speaker Series. My name is Lauren Craner. I'm president of IRI, for the few here that I don't know. This series is intended to bring policymakers and practitioners together to discuss contemporary challenges to governance and share ideas and experiences on how to effectively address those challenges. IRI believes strongly that democracy is more than elections. What happens between elections, governing, is equally important for a vibrant democracy. Along with our continuing work to develop political parties and civil society and to promote free elections, governance programming is a core component and a growing component of IRI's mission to advance and support democracy worldwide. In our programs, we work to strengthen the capacity of government and promote greater accountability by elected officials. Equally important, IRI works alongside civil society organizations to strengthen their ability to advocate before government and perform the ever-important task of oversight. As many of you know, IRI was founded by President Reagan to assist activists struggling for freedom in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, and to provide support to emerging democracies. IRI has worked in Eurasia ever since. Traditionally, programs have worked to promote political pluralism, strengthen political parties, and increase citizens' voices in elections and the decision-making process by building the capacity of civil society groups. Most recently, the Institute has sought to connect its work on either side of the democratic governance equation. IRI is currently working with both citizens and government in its governance programs in Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine, seeking to enable citizens to more easily access government services and encourage more transparent, efficient transactions with municipal offices. Looking back on IRI's 30-year experience in democracy assistance, we've seen that a country's ability to govern itself and to govern itself democratically is the key influencer that separates a nation's ultimate success and failure. In light of recent developments in the Eurasia region, especially the increasing government resistance to civil society in Russia and the success of the Georgia model of reform, it's important to discuss how these and other political currents influence democratic governance throughout the region. As such, we're very pleased to host today's discussion on governance in Eurasia. We hope that you gain an understanding of the successes and challenges facing the region, particularly in Ukraine, as well as a recognition that effective strategies to enhance democratic governments can contribute to a reduction in poverty, a guarantee of human rights, and an affirmation of the rule of law. It's my great pleasure today to welcome an old friend, IRI board member Jim Colby, to introduce the other presenters and lead today's discussion. Jim served our country and his state, Arizona, for 22 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's currently a senior transatlantic fellow for the German Marshall Fund of the United States and has spent much of his career working on issues related to budget development and allocation, on trade, on aid effectiveness, and on U.S.-European relations. He also recently traveled to Ukraine for IRI as a co-leader of our election observer mission there. We very much appreciate Jim's continuing contributions to our work. With that, let me turn it over to Jim Colby. Thank you, Jim.
Lauren, thank you very much, and welcome all of you here today. We're delighted to have you all with us, and for what I think will be a very, hopefully, a provocative, thought-provoking and thoughtful conversation about the future of democracy in Eurasia, where it goes, whither goes it. We have some terrific panelists here to discuss this this morning. I want to just mention that you have earphones because there will be some translation, and I think it's all on Channel 1. Is that correct? It'll be from Channel 1, from English to Ukrainian and vice versa. So if you're listening to it, you can turn it up to Channel 1 and, to listen to it in the language. As Lauren said, I returned from the Ukraine just a couple of weeks ago. It was actually my third election monitoring mission in the Ukraine. So I feel like I've become something of an expert in at least in watching elections take place in the city of Kiev, because I always seem to end up in the nation's capital there to watch this. But it certainly it was a different mood this time around than it was 8 years ago in 2004 at the time of the Orange Revolution, where there was so much hope and so much anticipation of a new and democratic government. I think today there's a feeling that just the wind is out of the sails a bit, and certainly there was a lot of concern about whether the steps are going backwards or whether they're going forwards in towards greater democracy in the Ukraine. These elections followed on what we had just seen, of course, in Georgia a month or two before, and so in the whole region, we have some real questions about what is the future of democracy. Have we really made the kind of progress we'd like to have seen in the last 20 years? Are we at least moving in the right direction, or are we moving backwards? And so today, to help us with that discussion, we have three panelists who are going to make some remarks, and then we're going to get into a dialogue, a real discussion, which will start off up here, and then we want to expand it by bringing all the audience into this. The panelists, I'll introduce all three of them and then call on them in the order that they are seated here. We're going to begin with Paul Saunders, who is the Executive Director of the Center for National Interest. He's also a member of the Center's Board of Directors. At the National Center, he's the Chief Operating Officer, and he also directs the U.S.-Russia relations program. But he's worked on a number of other issues, including climate change and energy and U.S.-Japan relations. He's been an associate publisher of the foreign policy magazine National Interest. He served in the Bush administration as an advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs. So he's worked on a lot of transnational issues, many of them in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, but also in South Asia as well as in China. Our second panelist, Nadia Duke, who I had the great privilege of traveling with to the Ukraine this current month, I should say, for the elections that we had over there. She is the Vice President for Programs for Europe and Eurasia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Sounds like that's just about everything, Nadia, at the National Endowment for Democracy. She has taught Soviet politics and Russian history at Oxford University, has been a research associate at the Society for Central Asian Studies, editor-in-chief of a London-based publication, the author of a number of books on the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and the changes taking place there, and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Sergei Odarch, and I'm not sure I have the pronunciation exactly correct there, but I'm sure I will be corrected on that, is the mayor of Cherkasy, Ukraine, a position that he's held now for, I think, 6 years. I think that's correct. He's a strong proponent of democratic reform and effective governance. He really stands out in the Ukraine. He is not the typical politician. He's a businessman who turned to politics. His roots in politics were found in the 1980s, where he was an activist in the People's Movement of Ukraine. And it was then that they were demanding independence from the USSR. This was before the final end of the Soviet Union, so Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. But he was demanding that movement was the one that began the demand for independence and for a democratic entrepreneurial system of governance in the Ukraine. As mayor, he has devoted his time and his attention to developing and incubating progressive civil society organizations. He's demonstrated a strong commitment to reform the city and to learn about governance, not only in the Ukraine, but in other experiences in Europe and around the world. So we feel especially privileged to have him with us here today. And so with that, if I might, let me turn to Paul and ask him for some initial comments, and then we'll go down the line, and after that, we'll get into some discussion. Paul Saunders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
It's Jim,
Let
please.
me move this a little bit closer. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I have focused a great deal on this region of the world during my career, but am not a particular expert on Ukraine, and most of what I know about Ukraine is on my shirt right here. So I think what I will do to start is maybe to make some broader comments about the Eurasian region and about governance in the region. And I actually have three particular points in mind that I'd like to make, and then I'll make an observation about policy and try to wrap it up there. And I have a few notes here which I'll look at, so excuse me if I look down at different points to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. The first thing that I think is very important for all of us to remember in thinking about democracy and governance and politics in general in this region is, how the countries of Eurasia became countries, and not just how they became countries, but how they ended up with the particular borders and therefore the particular populations that they have. And I think sometimes we forget about this. And it's very important to remember that the borders created between the Union republics of the Soviet Union were created by a Soviet communist leadership with a specific goal of preventing the Soviet Union from coming apart and making it more difficult, if anyone would try in the future to break the Soviet Union apart, for that to happen. And a key actor in this, of course, was Joseph Stalin, who was the first People's Commissar of Nationalities during the Civil War, and later became the General Secretary. Obviously, Stalin was a Georgian, as everybody knows, and he knew very well what he and other Soviet leaders were doing when, for example, they put North Ossetia in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, and they put South Ossetia in Georgia, in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. That was not, as they would say, not accidental. And we see really the legacy of decisions like that, across the former Soviet region. There were also decisions to move large numbers of members of different ethnic groups to different places. Russians settling, for example, in Central Asia, Russians settling in the Baltic states and other places. Of course, there was a very significant decision by Khrushchev to redraw the border between Ukraine and Russia. These decisions have a very strong impact on how these countries operate today and the political challenges that their leaders face. And it's something in the past that I've called, using somewhat colorful language, really a ticking time bomb that Soviet leaders put into place. And if we think about that and think about the process of the Soviet collapse, actually, I think we're quite fortunate that it wasn't much worse and much more violent than it was. And perhaps to look on the bright side, we're very fortunate that we're in a position to be having conversations about how these countries are governed rather than having conversations about, preventing catastrophes, having the kind of discussion that we're having about Syria today, for example, or having a very much larger version of the former Yugoslavia. So that's something which we appear to have avoided, and I think we should be grateful to have avoided. A second thing that I would say about history and the historical legacy, which I think is important to think about in this context, and I would broaden this a little bit even to include Central Europe. Many of the political actors and groups across this wider region that have tried to promote democracy and to promote better governance, many of them did it actually in direct reaction to their experience as part of the Soviet bloc or as part of the Soviet Union. And in some cases, it was even explicitly anti-Soviet or anti-Russian. And actually, in many of those places, those sentiments were a powerful mobilizing force, and they were actually fairly successful. Leaders in some Central European countries were, for example, I think were well able to mobilize a big share of their citizens on the basis of really rejecting the Soviet experience and trying to become part of Europe, part of NATO. And I think that helped to pull people along. If you look at the former Soviet Union as distinct from Central Europe, I think something similar has happened in many places. If you look at the Baltic states, again, for example, which have been, certainly quite successful compared to the other former republics of the Soviet Union, these are countries that the United States never recognized as part of the Soviet Union. Where many citizens believed during the Soviet period that they were living under occupation. And it was quite easy for them to reject that experience. If you look at other places like Central Asia, for example, Central Asia and many of the countries in Central Asia, they were among the countries that were most amenable to a new union treaty at the time that the Soviet Union was facing these great stresses toward the end of its life. They were perhaps most comfortable with Gorbachev's efforts to try to keep everything together. Leaders didn't mobilize those kind of sentiments after they became independent. They haven't really gone on that path. Ukraine is a very divided country from this perspective. And again, I'm not an expert on Ukraine at all, but my impression is that there are a number of people in Ukraine who very strongly reject that Soviet experience. And there are other people who don't reject it quite as strongly. And they may have their reservations about different things that happened in the past, but there are also elements of pride. And if you then turn and look at Russia, Russian leaders can't really mobilize their population on the basis of an anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, join the West argument. And I think that makes it certainly more challenging for them in some respects, because it takes away this tool that you can use to rally public support. The last thing that I'll say in terms of history is to talk about corruption. And I see corruption, frankly, as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, obstacles to good governance and democracy across Eurasia. And obviously, this is something that stretches all the way back into the Tsarist era and the Russian Empire. But frankly, I think it was really exacerbated in the later Soviet period, when you had a totally dysfunctional command economy. And really the only way for people to survive, and not just in their daily lives, but in running big enterprises, was specifically by bending, breaking, ignoring rules. And the rules became such an impediment to people's lives and their ability to do their jobs, at least in my view, that the idea of having rules became really somewhat delegitimized. Because these rules just create problems, and it's so much, why follow the rules when they're so complicated and difficult when you can just go to this friend or that contact or this other person. And, it's not always corruption. Corruption is kind of a narrow term, but just this idea of informal solutions to problems that don't necessarily follow the rules. And I think that is a legacy that has made it very difficult for the region to move into a rule of law, democratic society. And frankly, even in the post-Soviet period, I think immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this approach was really reinforced because you had an environment of legal chaos, economic chaos, and people just needed to do whatever they could do to survive. So finishing with history and moving forward to today and to policy, and here I'll just really make one point. I mentioned already, I see this issue of corruption and the rule of law as really the central challenge. Both to good governance, but certainly also to elections. I mean, there's no way that you can have a free and fair election in an environment where you can't enforce the rules equally on everyone. So from a policy perspective, I really see rule of law as the utmost priority, even personally to a greater extent, I think, than elections, for the reason that I just mentioned. It's very difficult to have a meaningful election. And circling back to what Lorne said, actually, at the outset, he mentioned a key principle of democracy and governance, which is accountability. And it would be terrific if governments could use elections to allow their populations to have accountability. But if elections don't work, which in many countries they clearly don't, then I really see the rule of law as a much more promising avenue to give people the accountability that they need over their governments. And I'm particularly pleased to have a chance to be on a panel with the mayor, and I look forward very much to hearing what he has to say, because from my perspective, the area of local governance is actually one where perhaps we can make the most difference. And again, from my point of view, when we focus on local governance, rule of law, trying to encourage and help local people and local governments to improve how things work, it's much less political. It's much less confrontational in dealing with a central government that may or may not be interested in external involvement in how their system works. And also, it really demonstrates to people in very concrete ways the difference that improved governance can make. You know, at the national level, when we talk about democracy and prosperity and those kinds of things, you know, the linkages, frankly, are a lot more tenuous. And in many cases, there are also differences of opinion over which economic policy is going to be better. And you can get stalled and tied in knots, and you know, populations become very frustrated because they feel like they've been promised democracy is going to lead to all of these things, and then it doesn't. At the local level, I think the connection is so concrete and so immediate for people. You know, my garbage is collected regularly. I can get access to health care. I don't have to bribe somebody to get, you know, whatever arrangement at school that I want, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very interested to hear what the mayor has to say, as I mentioned. I'll just leave it at that point, and thank you very much, Jim, and to IRI for having me.
Well, thank you, Paul. We'll be coming back to you as we get into this discussion, but we'll turn now to Nadia and ask for her thoughts about democracy in Eurasia.
Actually, democratic governance.
Democratic governance. Thank you.
When Monica actually, I stopped on that for a particular reason, because when Monica first was talking to me about participating here, I just kind of like saw the note and I thought, oh, they want to hear about the Ukrainian elections, and I kind of went off to the monitoring mission, which you were ahead of, and then came back, and then she said, well, actually the title is Democratic Governance in Eurasia, National Challenges and Municipal Successes. And I said, but I want to talk about the Ukrainian elections. And she said, but take a look. She was being very polite and diplomatic. But then once I actually started looking at the title, and of course, there's a big confluence. Democratic governance is a little different from governance, and it's a little different from good governance. And I'd like us to spend a little bit of time thinking through that. I notice here that it's national challenges and municipal successes. So we'll leave the municipal successes to Serhiy, and maybe I'll talk about the challenges more on a national level. And as well, go back a little bit in to set these. I will talk more about the Ukrainian elections, but I'd like to set them into a sort of, again, as well, into a historical context to understand what it is that we're dealing with here. Yes, what connection do the recent elections in Ukraine have to democratic governance? Well, you know, there's a very pat answer saying none at all, but actually let's delve into that and try and piece apart what we have, what we're trying to address, and what these elections actually showed us. Going back to the Soviet Union, the reason why the Soviet Union was governed probably actually quite well. So there probably was good governance in the Soviet Union at some point. But it was governed through a sort of top-down system, which they called the vertical. And this was something that everyone understood. Everyone knew that the orders came from the top, and the different layers, the administrative layers, whether they were kind of referred to as sort of political people or not, but they were basically administrative layers, both in the economy and in the sort of governing system of the Soviet Union. It all went one way. You got your orders from the top, and you were expected to implement them every level down. So when the Soviet Union came apart, most of those structures was still in place. And it has actually led to the situation, with the exception, again, of the Baltic states, who never really considered themselves to be part of the Soviet Union. And they still had a memory of parliamentary government between the wars. But in the rest of the Soviet space, what we were left with was basically a sort of presidential system that was superimposed upon that vertical of power. And they started calling things slightly different names, and maybe they gathered together the parliament a little bit more frequently, and those buildings actually became used. But essentially, the structure of government was the same. With the parliamentary system, you have the guy at the top. And I'm saying it is the guy at the top because we've only had one woman president. That was Rosa Otunbayeva from Kyrgyzstan, who actually very bravely and nobly stepped down when she said that she would. But you have the guy at the top, and the sort of knee-jerk response after the breakup of the Soviet Union was just to carry on the same system of sort of issuing orders the same way down. I mean, they had to cope with this sort of new element of kind of quasi-market economy, but that also didn't go quite according to plan. So that was one feature of this governing, of the way that governing did take place and has taken place since then, and the presidential system as well, as many people know who look very closely at the way that this works on the ground, often is accompanied by a huge apparatus that's called the President's Administration, which has no popular legitimacy. I mean, nobody votes for those people. It's an apparatus that is purely appointed by the President to help him rule and administer the country. And it's pretty much the same arrangement in each one of those post-Soviet states. The second feature of governance in the post-Soviet space is because, and this is the challenge, because there's a vertical of power, and actually some politicians are very proud of reinstituting the vertical of power. I seem to recall when Mykola Azarov became Prime Minister of Ukraine, he said very kind of proudly that, we're well on the way to restoring the vertical of power in our country, which I don't know whether he realized quite how that comes across to a Western audience. But anyway, the second feature of this kind of system and the real challenge is how do you, in a sense, sort of reverse this system? How do you get the people, citizens of these countries who are sort of on the bottom layer, how do you get them to connect to these structures or perhaps different structures? How do you get their voice to be heard? How do you get them to have some input into the way that their country is governed, so that it's not simply governance, so that it's not simply good governance that some benign person thought up, but that it is actually democratic governance in terms of, well, can we go back to the social contract of the people who are selected to represent and to actually carry out the business of governing, that they actually have the consent of the people who are being governed. So far, this has been kind of very, very shaky. And just as a sort of addendum to that point, I would highlight the role of political parties. Political parties are sort of somewhere in between. We really need to examine very closely what role do these political parties in the post-Soviet space actually perform at this time? Who do they represent? Do they actually perform the function of linking the people with the governing structures, or are they something else? Maybe we'll hear about that from Sevi sometimes. I can talk more about that if you'd prefer, but that's a whole other area. So getting back to Ukraine, Ukraine has actually been fairly unique in that its parliament, out of all of the parliaments in Eurasia, is actually probably the one national legislature where real debate has taken place and sometimes continues to take place, and that has actually adopted laws that somewhat reflect the will and desire of the people. Not always, and it's also one of the few legislatures that actually has taken in the views of the citizens, often conveyed through civic groups, and where legislation doesn't always originate with the president's apparat or with the ministers. It's had a sort of a slightly coloured, yes, that's a kind of loaded word in Ukraine, but it's had a sort of different history as it's in the last 20 years. Sometimes it's been more connected to people and sometimes less. And particularly since 2004, there was actually a deal struck by President Kuchma that he would relinquish his kind of claims to supporting the falsified revolution, as long and that he agreed to have some of the powers that he held in the presidency moving away from the presidency, which automatically made the parliament a little more important. This deal only lasted until halfway through the Yushchenko period, and maybe actually you can correct me if I'm saying something wrong here. And it didn't really quite work to solidify this parliamentary presidential system that everyone thought would arise, because unfortunately it sort of devolved into the opportunity for the prime minister and the president to engage in this sort of bickering, for want of a better word, and politics didn't move forward, democratic governance didn't much move forward, civil society progressed in leaps and bounds, but that's a slightly different story. So since the 2010 election, since the 2010 presidential election, of course, we all know the way that President Yanukovych has been actually drawing back those powers. The Verkhovna Rada, the Parliament of Ukraine, is now a lot weaker, has fewer powers than it had before, and also we've seen these. It's sort of degraded a little in terms of its significance. We've all seen these films of the piano players, which is that the members of parliament who actually push in the cards to vote for the members who are absent. So the whole way that the parliament has worked has kind of devolved a bit. We've seen the sort of fist fights that have taken place in the parliament. And I think these elections were actually an attempt to move the parliament even closer to being a rubber stamp than it has been in the last 2 years, because despite the last 2 years having been on a sort of negative track for the parliament, there have actually been some items of legislation that have been passed that have actually been very beneficial and in the long run will be very helpful to promote democratic governance. And I'm thinking specifically of the law on NGOs, which, if anyone's had an opportunity to take a look at it in detail, it's way ahead of most of the legislation that you find in the post-Soviet space, and particularly when you're comparing it with Russia, which is going through a huge crackdown on its civic sector right now. The new law in Ukraine actually allows NGOs to develop. It gives them more ability to support themselves and gives them a real role in governance, actually. So that's one track that remains to be seen how that develops. Still, nonetheless, this parliamentary election, I think, is still, and all parliamentary elections in Ukraine, is still kind of the closest thing that we see to a political battle that there is in the post-Soviet states. Georgia may be an exception, but in Georgia, my sense is that there's always been sort of one overwhelming ruling party, and the strength of the opposition this time really was predicated very much on access to funding by one of the oligarchs. Whereas in Ukraine, it's the situation with oligarchs and funding is very different, and we can go into that if anyone is interested. So getting to the what did we see at the Ukrainian parliamentary elections this time, and what should we be paying attention to? Despite the fact that I know our delegation found them to be very unclean, And there were huge attempts to manipulate. I think we all saw some of that in the reports of the domestic observers up until the election, and actually on the election day, a sort of unwillingness to accept results as they were in at least 13 of the constituencies. But the end result, actually, I found quite inspiring, because despite all of the money that was poured into this election, and there was a figure quoted by a Polish magazine that $225 million was spent on this election, which is a lot. I mean, it's not a lot compared to the American election, but when you compare it to a country like Germany, where $80 million was spent, and of course Germany has a population almost twice that of Ukraine, then you have to start wondering, well, what was all of that money spent on? And well, you can kind of hazard some guesses, but the upshot of that is that I think the clear message is that you can't buy elections in Ukraine anymore. Even this sort of Korolevska party project, which I think a lot of people know that a lot of money was put into that. I heard a figure quoted of $40 million. The party in the end only got something like 1%, and then they actually tried to sue the independent polling firm that was giving them 1%. And I think that it all devolved into a bit of a sort of farce, actually. So this shows that there was huge pushback from Ukrainian citizens, and my assessment of that is that Ukrainian citizens are showing that they're actually ready for real politics. They're getting fed up of this sort of manipulation, even, I think, with all due respect to the opposition, but I think the opposition also is sort of trying to keep Ukrainian citizens out, in a sense, other than just sort of appealing to sort of some populist slogans to promote their own campaigns. Why is it not going to be the sort of expected rubber stamp? Well, the Party of Regions is going to be very hard pressed to get a majority, which is a long way away from what some people anticipated, which was out of a 450-seat parliament, if you control 300 of the seats, you get what is called a constitutional majority, which means that you can pass you can change the constitution with that amount of votes. However, just a simple majority, 225, with the 185 seats that the Party of Regions has now, they're going to have to go into coalition with somebody. The communists have already said that they're going to stand alone. There's self-anointed, what they call samovisuvanci, who, a lot of them, of course, are Party of Regions, but there are also other oligarchs who are supporting some of those candidates too, and not all of them will go with the Party of Regions. So you have 43 so-called independents, and even then it's kind of, getting from 185 to 225. We'll have to see quite how they intend to do that. The Communist Party also revived its fortunes with, let's see, how much did they get? 13 or so percent, and a lot of that was actually having been close to sort of zero in the previous elections. The communists, this could be read actually as a sort of protest vote against the Party of Regions in the East. And we have two new forces in the parliament. One is Udar, the other is Svoboda. Udar with almost 14%. This is of the proportional side of the vote, and Svoboda with 10%. And of course, the Batkivshchina party, which got 25% on the proportional side. So these are new elements in the parliament. And I think they do show a sort of hankering for being more ideological. The Svoboda party, of course, remains a big question mark. It has some murky origins in terms of funding. However, there was overwhelming support for it in the west of Ukraine in the absence of any other sort of moderate national democratic forces that were viable. And I think I'm looking to the two-party institutes, IRI and NDI, to really work with these parties now to integrate them into a system that will provide a kind of strong platform for democratic governance and governing in the future, so that we might actually get to a point in Ukraine where the people do actually have some role in deciding how they are governed, finally. Maybe I'll just stop there and turn over to Serhiy.
Well, thank you very much, Nadia, for very good explanation of the kind of direction that we're going. And I pose, I think, a good question for me to turn it over to Serhiy, because you talked about how the Soviet Union used to be from top down. Everybody took their orders from the top down and in the component parts of the Soviet Union. So how do you change it to a system where it's from the bottom up, where governance comes from the bottom up, from the people itself? And so I'd like to turn it to Serhiy to talk to us a little bit about how that's accomplished in a community like Cherkasy. How do you change the political system so that it is a democratic governance from the bottom up?
Thank you for invitation to take part in this discussion. But sorry, my English is not so good. I will talk in Ukrainian.
I will start from supporting position of Mr. Sanders
про те, що треба приділяти дещо більше уваги місцевому самоврядуванню.
Attention should be paid to local governance.
Справа в тому, що політична еліта України на сьогоднішній день
Case is that political elite of Ukraine
одна
are
і та сама група людей.
predominantly the same group of people.
Після помаранчевих подій частина партії
The
регіонів
orange events, part of the Party of Regions, joined Tymoshenko's bloc.
Після перемоги Януковича в 10
After victory of Yanukovych in 2010, the same part moved back to the Party of Regions.
там 10-15 років
And during last 10-15 years,
докорінних змін
there are no
ні в людях,
essential changes in the administration of the country. I'm talking about the people and consciousness of the authorities.
самоврядування, воно значно демократичніше.
That's why in this case, local governance is much more democratic, and this is the field
Відбувається політична конкуренція.
where political competition takes place in Ukraine.
Сьогодні на рівні місцевого самоврядування з'являються нові лідери.
There are new leaders on the local governance level appearing today in Ukraine, new teams, and I want to say that majority of my colleagues, mayors of small and middle cities, they are very young people,
Сучасного світогляду.
and their worldview is quite different. It's very modern and democratic.
Сказати про три напрямки, в яких ми проводили реформування в місті Черкаси,
I would like to talk about three directions of the reforms in the city of Cherkasy,
в числі і політичного розвитку всієї держави.
and which are possible on the level of the development of whole state.
You know where is Ukraine? Yes.
Yeah.
Перший напрямок нашої роботи
So the first direction
подолання
our work
корупції на місцевому рівні.
is fighting corruption on local level to the extent possible,
І створення таких управлінських процедур, які створюють комфорт для
an establishment of such administrative procedures
взагалі можливості для корупційних.
which actually liquidate possibilities for corruption.
Цього року ми докорінно змінили систему надання адміністративних послуг
This year we substantially changed a system of providing administrative services.
в одному приміщенні,
So they are provided in one premises today,
абсолютно відкритому просторі.
in very open space.
Всі послуги, які стосуються надання дозволів,
All services which concern licenses, permissions,
земельних ділянок,
allocation of land plots,
надання послуг в частині будівництва,
provision of services in the area of construction,
обслуговування підприємств в частині реєстрації,
services of enterprises in supporting their documents, registering their documents. Comfortable
максимально використовуються
conditions were created,
електронної черги,
and digital queue system, digital line system was launched.
послуг через електронний документообіг без
system of providing e-services were launched as well without citizens having to meet bureaucrats. During 6 months, we can see the results. If earlier citizens had to wait for several hours in the queue and to look for corruptional ways of solving their problems, on average, they have to wait from 4 to 5 minutes to be served. January 1st, we plan to provide all services in the area of registering ownership rights. And on the same area, we plan to open all information regarding land issues and to have open space, open office system regarding land issues. Today in the city of Cherkasy, you can receive services on internet without contacting mayoral officials.
Системи, телефонні, електронні пошти, Фейсбуки, через
Facebook, ICQ, Skype.
через Skype і таке інше. Також окреме нововведення – це участь громадян
Separate innovation was participation of citizens in governing the city and providing by citizens recommendations about problems of the city. There is a digital system which can be used by any citizen who can provide information on some particular problems of the city, and corresponding service of the city which works 24 hours controls the system, and then it controls fulfillment of those of solving those problems. In the right column, you can see highlighted by green services which were problems which were solved, in red which were not solved yet, and this system is very controlled by local services.
Новинок. Буквально місяць тому ми запровадили ще систему надання сигналів про
We introduced a system of providing signals of problems by GPS.
Кілька автомобілів. Автомобіль мера перший.
Some cars, including first of all mine car, are provided with special remote controls. And when me or somebody else travels around the city and see a problem, I can press any button. For example, open sewage collector or functional lighting system, and immediately on this map, mayoral officials will see the problem on exact location and exact problem, and correspondingly he will give the task to put everything into order in this place.
Наступний напрямок нашої активності був
Next direction of our activity,
максимальній прозорості в діяльності мерії.
most possible transparency of the city council. Website of city council, this is a screen from the website. Each evening costs which were allocated to the city budget and spent money can be seen on the website of the city's website. So as a result, citizens can see how their money are spent, how their taxes are spent every day. Anyone can address city council, city officials regarding very particular problems, very particular issues, and to receive respective response. All sittings held in the executive committee, all sittings of the city council, they are going online. Even sitting in Washington, you can turn on those websites and you will see me or Mr. Bezubenko holding on sittings or assemblies. That's why journalists are not going to our press conferences, because at 8 a.m. they already know what's going on in the city.
знову ж таки, всі соціальні мережі, так само відкрита мерія.
All social networks can be used to reach mayoral office.
Він з одного боку здається господарським.
Its direction, it seems to be economic one, talking about energy saving in the city,
Але я його розглядаю як політичне питання,
but I deem it as a political question,
тому що для України сьогодні немає більшої перешкоди в
because for Ukraine there is no larger obstacle
побудові незалежності,
in developing independence
в розбудові демократії,
and democracy,
повна залежність від російського
so
газу,
there is no larger obstacle as
поставка
full dependence on Russian gas
на природний газ.
in prices for this gas.
Сьогодні, щоб ви розуміли,
Today,
після підписання нових угод і переход на нові ціни з Газпромом,
after new agreement was signed with Gazprom,
кожен українець
every citizen, every day,
перераховує Газпрому в середньому $1
pays Gazprom $1 of extra money, basically overpays
гривень щодня з кожної кишені
almost $1
українця.
every day, every citizen of Ukraine, including those who are not using gas.
Ці кошти перераховуються російському монополісту.
Those money go to Russian monopolist Gazprom.
Ми з нашою командою поставили собі таку
So me and my team set a very ambitious task
повністю відмовитись від використання
to refuse fully from the usage of gas
теплопостачання.
in the heating system of the whole city.
В цьому напрямку ми працюємо сьогодні із Світовим банком.
We are working today with World Bank, with the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development.
Перші проекти є достатньо успішними.
First projects have been implemented already and they are very successful.
Цілий житловий мікрорайон ми перевели
For example, one microdistrict, residential microdistrict,
на виробництво гарячої води,
uses
виробництво тепла
warm water and heat
допомогою відходів деревини.
only by wood refuse, and they do not use gas anymore. It was realized together with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Якщо раніше за рік тільки за цю котельню ми сплачували майже $1 мільйон Газпрому за природний газ,
Almost $1 million.
то за цей рік ми сплатили 3 мільйони гривень, тобто в 2,5 рази менше, і заплатили своїм громадянам, жителям міста, жителям навколишніх сіл за заготівлю відходів деревини.
And moreover, we paid our citizens for wood refuse they provided to
І
us.
сьогодні завдяки цій програмі ми створюємо
Thanks to this program, today we create new job places.
Є вигідним бізнес по вирощуванню енергетичних рослин, по заготівлі
And today many people started preparing food refuses and growing up trees and
для поставок
other wood which can be used for providing to this heating system. So all this money, all those costs remained in our city. They didn't, not a single kopeck went to the Russian monopolist.
Минулого року ми запровадили повний щоденний облік всіх енергоресурсів, які споживаються всіма
Introduced
бюджетними
accounting
установами, школами, дитячими садками, лікарнями.
consumption resources which are used by all administrative buildings,
Скажу, що навіть без якихось капіталовкладень,
municipal buildings.
тільки завдяки обліку ми зменшили
Only
на
thanks to this
24%
accounting,
споживання води.
managed to decrease water consumption by 24%
Зменшилося споживання електроенергії і на
12%
11% зменшилося споживання
and
тепла.
consumption of heating by 11%. And this happened only due to daily accounting of the usage
Ми
of
проводимо
those resources.
щороку, уже впродовж 3 останніх років,
3 years,
модернізацію і наших
we carry out modernization of our
замінюємо вікна,
municipal houses. So we substitute windows, we insulate buildings.
провели от 2 роки експлуатації, рік експлуатації, ми зменшили споживання енергоресурсів на 35-45%.
Buildings, we have already decreased consumption 5 to up to 40%.
Стосується підтримки житлових будинків, ті будинки, які перейшли в статус кондомініумів, які утримуються
condominiums.
громадянами.
So they are taken held by citizens themselves.
Енергозбереженню в цих будівлях.
We are funding some events aimed at energy consumption.
Фотографії з лівої сторони ви бачите Частина будинку, там, де люди взяли його на утримання, з допомогою міста провели утеплення.
Picture on the left, you can see
Втрати вдвічі втрати тепла, ніж в тій частині будинку,
people insulated the building. And compared to the right side of both pictures, were building which was not insulated. So red color means that consumption is really high.
Черкаси можуть, ми де-факто зменшили закупівлю газу в Росії на 24%.
As of today, we decreased buying Russian gas by 24%.
Тепла генерувати без використання природнього газу.
Percent of all heatings without using Russian gas.
Міняти державну політику, на жаль.
But unfortunately, to realize this aim, we have to change national policy, which donates price of Russian gas.
Енергетичній сфері українського вугілля.
That's why it's not beneficial to use Ukrainian coal, for example, Ukrainian wood, or other substitutes for.
І на завершення я хотів би кілька слів сказати про вибори, які
Sum up,
сьогодні так всіх турбують.
I want to say some words about the elections, which everyone is talking about.
Я вважаю, що загалом вибори пройшли
I think that in general,
достатньо демократично.
elections were quite democratic.
Ми дійсно мали реальну конкуренцію між
We did
політичними
have a competition between political parties, between candidates.
Дійсно, те, про що говорила Надя, ці вибори показали, що
What Nadia told us that
з кожними виборами грає все
financial
менше і менше
resources
значення у
play
виборчій кампанії.
importance in the election campaign.
Тому що по кількості фінансового ресурсу, який був в ці вибори вкладений, мабуть, ці вибори в Україні були рекордними. Ніколи так багато не вкладалося.
Because actually the money invested in those elections, it was the record amount of money.
Могла не те, що сформувати
However, the party of government was not able to
в новообраному.
have majority in the parliament. We are not talking about constitutional majority, but even a simple majority in the parliament.
Я думаю, що основні події в парламенті будуть відбуватися
I think major events in the parliament will take place during next 2 years.
В якому форматі зараз не була сформована більшість, вона буде
The format of current majority will be in the parliament today. Whoever forms this majority, it will be very shaky.
Сьогодні навіть партія регіонів в
Then
своєму
the Party of Regions,
має три абсолютно різних і
three
дуже
absolutely different and very powerful
групи впливу.
groupings of influence within the party.
Це вплив, так би мовити, традиційно донецької групи.
All this is influence of traditional Donetsk group.
Це вплив газового лобі.
Second group is gas lobby.
І це вплив, власне, самого президента Януковича
And the
і його
influence
найближчого оточення.
of the president Yanukovych himself and his closest associates.
І, як на мене, оці внутрішні протиріччя між цими
As
групами
internal
разом з
conflicts
кількох
within the party,
опозиційних достатньо великих фракцій в
and
парламенті
considering quite large oppositional factions in the parliament,
політичний рух.
will ensure further democratic movement of Ukraine.
Я думаю, що з наближенням президентських виборів 2015 року
Approaching to the 2015 presidential election,
очікувати серйозних перегрупувань
there will be serious regroupings in the parliament,
більшості.
maybe even change of majority. And it may happen in 2015.
Дякую.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Let me just start off with a question to each of them, and then we're going to open it up to everybody else.
Дозвольте розпочати з питань в першу чергу.
With Sergey, you laid out a very impressive
Ви представили дуже вражаючу програму реформ, яка відбувається в вашому місті.
Do you have any concerns with the new government, or the new parliament, I should say? Do you have any concerns that the new parliament will attempt to take away some of
Чи не побоїтесь ви, що новий парламент забере якісь повноваження з місцевого рівня на національний? Вашу думку, яка буде законодавча ініціатива цього парламенту, зокрема в найближчі місяці?
Я думаю, що нічого радикального в парламенті і в уряді в Україні не
I
відбудеться.
think there will be no radical changes in the parliament or government in Ukraine in the nearest months or even the nearest year.
Одна з головних проблем України на сьогоднішній
One of the major problems of Ukraine, in my opinion,
це відсутність у політичної еліти єдиного бачення
is absence among political establishment of the single view on the development of Ukraine.
Тобто, з одного боку, ми
So on the
маємо
one hand,
частину людей,
we have part of people,
ми маємо рух на рівні законодавства,
we have some movement
ринкової економіки.
on the level of legislation towards market economy.
А з іншого боку,
On the other hand,
намагаємося зберегти
we try to save and increase
соціалістичну частину
socialist part
нашої економіки.
of our economy.
Тобто ми говоримо з одного боку про
On
ринок,
the one hand, we are talking about the market, while on the other hand,
ми збільшуємо соціальні.
we are increasing social benefits.
Ми говоримо про конкуренцію.
We are talking about competition,
Можна в
but at the same time,
років не працювати ні
for tens of years, citizens of Ukraine cannot go to labor for a single minute and can receive permanent social benefit from the state.
Ви знаєте, скільки в Україні жінок
Do you know how many women in Ukraine
мають дітей,
who have children,
але не знають, від кого їх народили?
who have children but don't know who the father is?
Майже 5 мільйонів жінок
Almost
народили дітей
5 million people
не знають,
gave birth to a child without knowing who the father is.
А чому? Тому що
Do you know why?
таким жінкам платимо
Because the
300
state
гривень щомісяця додаткових фінансів
pays
державного бюджету.
$40 every month additional money as a single mothers.
При тому ці жінки живуть з цими чоловіками в одній квартирі.
But those women live with fathers of their child in the same flat, but they apply for the social benefit as single mothers to receive those money.
Тому виходить, що ми однією рукою будуємо капіталізм,
So,
а другою комунізм.
with one hand we are building capitalism, and with the other hand we are building communism.
Проблема, вона інституційна.
The second problem is institutional one.
У нас сьогодні, от, я вважаю,
In my opinion, today, as never before,
в середовищі радників президента,
among advisors of Ukraine
адміністрації
and
президента,
apparatus of the presidential administration,
дуже грамотні, прогресивні
there
консультанти
are very professional consultants
з правильним сучасним світоглядом, переважно
with very modern worldview, many of them young people
35 років,
of 30-35 years,
які добре знають світову практику, демократичну практику.
who have very good knowledge of democratic governance of the world.
До виконання, то уряд Миколи Азарова – це носій саме от
But
комуністичного.
talking about implementation, government of Mykola Azarov is a bearer of communist worldview.
І тому хороші декларації,
That's why
хороші
good
плани,
intentions,
вони
good
на рівні
declarations,
реалізації в уряді, вони
they are
просто
stuck on the level of realization by the government of Ukraine, by the cabinet of ministers.
погляд.
So in my opinion, the main problem is worldview, and Ukraine has decided on the level of elites.
На захід чи на
Whether we are moving towards west or towards east.
комунізму, чи
Are we moving towards communism
до ринкової
or
економіки.
towards market economy?
Без цього ми будемо так от
Without it,
коливатися.
we will be like pendulum.
Thank you very much. So that leads really right into the question I wanted to ask to Nadia.
Наступне питання в мене до Наді.
Поки що не буде нічого втілюватися.
As of today,
Знають, куди рухатися.
as of today, there will be no radical changes because they don't know in which way they are going to move.
Thank you. Nadia, you pointed out the numbers. You noted the numbers that are elected in each faction in the parliament. How do you think a majority is going to be put together, or will it be put together on a kind of a ad hoc basis, case by case, issue by issue? And is President Yanukovych going to be spending much of his next 3 years trying to groom his successor, and where is that likely to come from?
You really want me to answer all of those truthfully? So far, I think it's a good thing, actually, that the parliament, I mean, they need a majority to be able to function to pass these laws. I think in so many other of the post-Soviet states, the parliament really is a rubber stamp that doesn't hold for anything. So the fact that we're going to have this, that they're going to have this problem putting together a majority, I think is actually a very interesting and actually positive thing in the end. I've been looking at the numbers, and it is kind of interesting because one of the reasons I think that the Party of Regions was not able to get the result that it was anticipating was that, of course, there was a sort of citizen revolt from below, but also I think some of the oligarchs were also kind of, putting in, hedging their bets, spreading their money around, and supporting some of those independent candidates, putting some money into the party. So it's the way that the party factions come out in the end is actually going to be a little bit of negotiation with the oligarchs as well. I mean, they actually also want to know from Yanukovych which way is he taking the country, because at the beginning of his time in office, there was this sort of implicit deal that, well, okay, we're going to support you, but, the deal is you're supposed to get us into Europe. And so far that hasn't happened. It's a little hard to tell, and as well, I don't want to sort of malign anyone who has good intentions to begin with, but that the Communist Party has already said that it's going to stand alone, but then it added a caveat that, but it will vote whichever way its members feel that they should vote, which means that they could actually, on a kind of ad hoc or even more systematically, vote with the Party of Regions. A lot of those independents will go with the Party of Regions because they were supported by them. And it's not out of the question that you'll get what in Ukrainian is called tushki, which means people who were members of one party at the time of the election migrating to another party, and of course the groundwork for this is also always laid with huge amounts of money. We'll see how that goes, but I don't doubt that the Party of Regions will get a majority, because I think they can't afford to not have one. I mean, they'll come to one, and as well, the oligarchs will also understand that they can't sort of stymie the work of the parliament because there isn't a working majority. But I think it'll be interesting as to how it goes. On Yanukovych himself, there are various scenarios that are already being kind of promoted as to what's going to happen in 2015, and the most common one is that he will run himself. He's of course grooming his sons to be successors. There are two sons, and they've managed to accumulate huge amounts of wealth in the last 2 years since he's been president. But the way that he will continue his presidency is that there will be a candidate from the opposition running against him, and you can already see that the way that the Svoboda party is being sort of built up with various sort of machinations, it should be the kind of candidate that will be popular in one part of the country, but the other part of the country will never vote for. You had this scenario played out in 1999 with Kuchma and the communist candidate. There are some experts, analysts, who say that this is going to be what they're going to try and do in 2015 with Yanukovych against probably Tiahnebok of the Svoboda party, which suggests a high degree of manipulation. However, there are many other people who would also like to have that president's seat, and some of them are actually oligarchs themselves. So I'd say stay tuned. This is going to be interesting. You may be in Ukraine again on another observer mission for the most important election that Ukraine has had so far, which they all are, of course.
Thank you. Paul, what does this all portend? Georgia, the Ukraine, the elections there. Is the trend line positive? What can you see in the future for the other Soviet republics, or places as dismal as Belarus, for example? I mean, is there anything positive on the horizon in some of the other countries? Where are we going?
Well, that's a pretty tough question, I think. Certainly, long term, I remain pretty optimistic. But I've always had the view that these are very slow processes. And I think Ukraine is a case that illustrates very, very clearly the capacity in any of these societies for reversals and changes in direction. So I don't really see, while I'm long-term optimistic, because I think that people have aspirations to have a voice and a greater voice in how they're governed. I think the road to getting there could be a pretty tough one. And, we may see end results that work out a little bit differently from what we expect in advance. And, certainly Russia is the case that I know the best. And, if you had an election in Russia today that was a free and fair election for the Russian president and for a Russian parliament, thinking more broadly about American national interests, I'm not sure that the outcome of that would necessarily be a favorable one for the United States. Some of the...
Would it be any different than what we have today?
Actually, I think it could be. I think it could be. President Putin has not been shy about trying to use Russian nationalism politically to mobilize people, but he has not really turned over the country's foreign policy to nationalist impulses. And there are some very smart, talented, and ambitious people in that country who probably would take a different approach on that. And there's one in particular that I have in mind who I think would have a very good chance in a free and fair election of becoming president, and I'm not at all sure that that's a good thing. Although actually I like him personally. I'm just not sure it's a good thing. Maybe I'll leave it there, because that's a big question.
So I guess we could say at best, if we have 2 steps forward, we're probably going to take at least 1 step backward here. It's a long and slow process.
Right.
Let's open it up for some questions around the table here.
A good Lenin quote, by the way.
Yes, right. We'll open up for questions. Do use the microphone because of our translator, and please identify yourself, and you can direct the question to one panelist or to all, but hopefully maybe to one. Yes, sir.
I'm Charlie Greenleaf from Alexandria, and was at Cherkasy in the 2010 elections, and met with the mayor. Mr. Mayor, you have many impressive reforms here, and your presentation was very interesting. 2 questions about it. One, what kind of financial support did you get to carry out these reforms? And 2, what sources of support from the outside, help, advice, did you get?
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for this question.
Переважно ми розраховуємо на свої
Predominantly, we use our own financial resources, our own income of the city.
І коли мова йде про серйозні інвестиції,
But talking about serious investment,
місто продає землю або продає своє
sells
нерухомості
land plots or property and directs resources
наші проекти.
into most important projects.
Ми дуже мало маємо підтримки з боку держави.
We have very low support from the state, from the national level.
Тому що державні проекти, як правило, вони
Because national projects, as a rule,
корупційні.
are very corruptional.
Тобто уряд готовий надавати якусь
The cabinet of ministers is ready to support some projects,
повертати якусь частину.
But usually one has to give back a kickback to some private persons.
Сьогодні ситуація значно краще, ніж була. Сьогодні
Today the situation is much better,
розмір такого повернення або
as
відкату
this kickback
становить приблизно 20%.
is amounts to 20%.
В уряді Тимошенко це було від 40 до 60.
During Tymoshenko cabinet of ministers, this kickback amounted from 40 to 60%.
Але позиція нашої команди, ми принципово не беремо участі в таких проєктах.
But we have principal position of our team. We are not supporting such. We are not participating in such projects.
І другий напрямок фінансової підтримки – це
And second direction of financial support
співпраця з світовими фінансовими установами.
is cooperation with world finance institutions.
Черкаси – це єдине місто, яке
Cherkasy is the only city in Ukraine which works with the European Bank on reconstruction and development without governmental guarantees, without any participation by the government.
Що стосується можливих напрямків,
As for possible directions, financial support,
ми зараз активно намагаємося залучити підтримку різноманітних
we try to involve some support of some donors organizations for public projects.
Ми зараз завершуємо роботу, і наступного місяця ми відкриваємо великий
Next month,
ресурсний
we
центр.
plan to open a large resource center for NGOs.
Тобто всі організації будуть мати
All
нормальні умови для
NGOs will have great conditions to work.
розміщення для проведення.
They will have good premises to carry out conferences, discussions.
Причому ми будуємо принципово цей громадський ресурсний центр
Moreover, we are
на засадах
constructing this
самоорганізації.
civic resource center on the basis of self-organization.
Тобто міський голова або майбутній міський голова не зможе сказати, що
The mayor of Cherkasy or future mayor of Cherkasy will not be able to tell to some NGO that we are allowed to work here and to prohibit to another NGO.
приміщення
We just provide them free of charge large premises for their work, and they will decide who will work there.
Тому, скажімо, сьогодні ми шукаємо гранти для реалізації цього проекту для максимального
So
технічного.
today we are looking for grants to realize this project. First of all, for technical equipment of such premises.
Ми так само сьогодні хочемо повністю
Besides, we want
мерії винести в інтернет, щоб
to move all work of the authorities to the internet,
їх в режимі реального часу
so that
відстежувати
each citizen of the city
рух, скажімо, своїх документів
could monitor
через різні підрозділи
over
мерії.
movement of his documents among different departments of the mayoral office.
І також шукаємо сьогодні гранти на реалізацію цього.
And we are looking for grants to realize this project as well.
Ми розпочали в цьому році великий проект
This year we launched a big project,
ефективного енерговикористання
efficient energy consumption.
програм в наших дитячих
So
садках.
this is educational program for schools and kindergartens.
Також сьогодні шукаємо партнерів, хто міг би допомогти фінансувати.
And we are looking for partners in this project as well,
Щоб дитина з самого маленького
who
віку
could co-fund such project, so that children from
ще й не просто
very young age
ставилась, а вчила
begins
своїх батьків так само
to treat nature properly, to treat energy consumption properly, and not only himself or herself, but to teach their parents to do so as well.
Thank you. Yes, in the back.
Formerly with USAID in Central Asia as a democracy officer. Mr. Mayor, and perhaps others would want to comment on this further. I think you did, Nadia, generally. As you look across your country, what do you see as the degree of the vitality of NGOs in relating to policy at the local level and at the parliamentary level? The two wonderful things that you've cited here are perfect subjects for that, transparency and environmental or energy concerns.
I think, yes, we'll start again with you.
Мені здається, що особливо на місцевому рівні вплив НГО, він значно вищий, ніж на рівні національному. І взагалі, коли говорити про ті тенденції, які я спостерігаю і в Україні, і за межами України, в європейських країнах, то з кожним роком вплив формальних громадських утворень, а в останні роки за допомогою соціальних мереж вплив навіть неформальних утворень громадських на локальну політику, він зростає і серйозно зростає. Мені здається, що напевно з кожним роком вплив чисто традиційних партійних систем на формування органів місцевої влади і на прийняття рішень на місцевому рівні він буде зменшуватись, а вплив НГО буде зростати.
Turn to you, Nadia. So you see this as an ongoing process that it's going to continue.
Yes.
Right. Nadia?
I have kind of two sort of views and comments about this. Having had a sort of professional life where I've been involved in making decisions on funding to NGOs particularly in this part of the world for the best part of a quarter of a century now, I've come to some conclusions, and you can really tell by the kinds of projects that civic groups or NGOs take up as to what the sort of health of the democracy is in that country. When a country is just sort of has just gone through, either a breakthrough election or has just become independent, as the Soviet, post-Soviet states did in 1991, or is just sort of emerging out of a period of authoritarianism. Usually the kind of programs that the civic groups want to do are very sort of straightforward human rights programs, defense of rights types of programs, because normally they're getting hammered by the state still. And then there's usually a sort of progression of the next kind of stage, or simultaneous to that stage, is the need to have information, because typically governments will control information, and again getting objective information and getting more information simply into the hands of the citizens is normally a kind of vigorous area of work for NGOs. And then I see at the end of the spectrum actually is this sort of, and I'm happy to announce that Ukraine is actually at the end of the spectrum, where on a local level and also on a national level, you have groups that are monitoring government institutions and agencies for accountability, holding politicians accountable or officials of all sorts accountable, and pressing for transparency. And this is usually the sort of that's the other end of the spectrum. So I'm very, and normally at the NED we do a sort of analysis of what types of programs we're supporting, and in the countries of Central Asia, a lot of them are straightforward human rights, because that's the kind of day-to-day problem. Countries like Ukraine, we're looking at a lot of accountability programs. Russia, unfortunately, still is in the sort of protecting human rights and providing information stage. And just another observation about the role of NGOs and civic groups. It's becoming clear to me that the way that political parties have formed, particularly in this part of the world and also in other parts of the world, is a little different from the sort of Western liberal tradition that I think we all just sort of assume. What happened after the Industrial Revolution, that and this is where having red marks actually does come in useful. That where people sort of move on to become middle class, the political parties form to represent their interests, there's a kind of competition on the political sphere as well as in the social sphere. Political parties in this part of the world are very different, and in Ukraine, again, with all due respect to those who are trying to make it different, they really represent the interests of the financial group that supports them. And that's being very sort of like overly simplistic, but the way that political parties are formed is different, and the way that they operate is different as well. So, in a sense, I see that the way for a political landscape to really be operational and to kind of provide the citizens with what it needs, you do need to have civic groups who are operating almost sort of hand in hand with the political parties to get to the point where I think we all want the citizens of these countries to have their interests represented, to be able to change their governments when they no longer are responding to them. And that means that civic groups actually have a much larger role in this than I think we appreciate, having grown up in this kind of a system or in Western Europe. So again, that's just another observation.
Paul, you've spent a lot of your focus, of course, is on Russia. Would what Sergei said about NGOs at the local level in the Ukraine be true in Russia? I mean, recently, I think they've just enacted a requirement that the NGOs have to be registered if they receive any kind of money from outside, a rather chilling effect, at least, on NGOs there. What is the status of NGOs in Russia?
Sure. You know, certainly in Russia, I think, broadly speaking, there is more scope for that kind of activity at the local level than the national level. But I would also draw a different kind of distinction, which I think is the one that the Russian government and leadership draws between NGOs that are providing social services, which I think the Russian government broadly tolerates and even encourages in certain respects, and NGOs that want to get involved in politics. And that's where we see this heavy pressure, which I think is, from Russia's perspective, or at least from the perspective of people in the leadership, a direct reaction to American and European efforts to try to use foreign financing to play a role in their politics. You know, on a longer-term basis, you know, personally, I think that the Russian government has put itself in a fundamentally unsustainable position by trying to make this distinction between two different kinds of NGOs. Because I don't really think that they will succeed over time in saying, well, you know, go ahead and organize yourselves and show initiative and raise money and do all of these other things, you know, to address these problems. But don't touch those problems. I don't think that's going to work over time. And like I said, I think it's fundamentally unsustainable. And my long-term view is that the more politically oriented NGOs will ultimately have more scope for action than they do now. But certainly in this current period, you know, Putin has gone through a re-election process that I think was a lot more complicated and difficult than he really expected. I think that it has highlighted the degree to which that political system is not as stable as a lot of people inside it and outside it may expect. You know, he's clearly reacted by trying very much to clamp down. The fundamental question, actually, I think, is how much has Russia changed between when Putin first came to power after Yeltsin in 2000 and today? And is Putin actually still trying to govern the same country that he was governing at that time? And will he be successful in using the strategies that he learned and perfected during that time period now? I view those as the really interesting questions looking forward.
Thank you. I guess to summarize, we might say that an NGO like IRI or NDI that's engaged in democracy building probably has a little rough road ahead of it for a while.
I think that's right.
Other questions, comments from around the table here? Anybody else? Well, yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Taft. I'm with the Tintalin Group. And the responses to these questions, especially the ones with respect to the involvement of citizens, implies that there's actually a desire among citizens to be involved, or even a concept in their mind that they can have an influence. And where do you see the opportunities for perhaps educating, depending on how developed this civil society is, educating citizens that they actually have a role, and then having the vision for thinking, oh, I as one or I as 10, a group of 10 individuals can have an impact. And I think your example, Mr. Saunders, regarding Russia tolerating certain types of NGOs and not the others, it takes a pretty courageous person in Russia to want to be involved in anything having to have an influence on the political front. And yet, it often, what's the NGOs that are involved, say, in working with the disabled community, are those that realize, okay, I can actually have an influence on the education of my child, I can get involved, and then it can evolve from there. So where do you see the opportunities, especially across Eurasia, to create the vision?
That's a broad question. I think we'll turn it to Paul, and the others may want to have some comment on it as well. Paul?
Let me go back to something that I said in my original opening comments about working at the local level. I think that one of the best ways to reinforce the idea that participation and starting or working for an NGO, volunteering for an NGO, can make a difference is precisely at that local level, because there's such a clear connection between your level of effort and what you're doing and the result that you get. And because the targets of what people are trying to do, they're smaller pieces, they're often much more achievable objectives. So I see personally, programs that focus on trying to get people involved in solving community problems as really a way to open their eyes in the way that you described, that, I can have an influence, but also to teach them strategies or help them formulate their own strategies for how to do that. And if you build a large cadre of people who have the sense that they can solve problems and have some experience at how to do it, then you have a group that you can turn to other tasks, and I think some of them would, naturally gravitate to other things. So, again, over the longer term, I'm relatively optimistic that's what will happen.
Others of you want to comment on that one?
Including NGOs into the decision-making process is a very slow process in Ukraine. Our citizens for 70 years were educated, and they were told that they are not participating in the decision-making process, but instead it's the government who takes the decision instead of them. But to the extent possible, me personally support activity of NGOs in taking decisions, in participating in the decision-making process. One of the main directions of this work is development of so-called neighboring associations, which means associations of local citizens of a building or micro-district to solve local problems. For example, last week, Cherkasy City Council approved a decision together with one of the neighborhood associations, and instead of construction of residential area, we are going to build their park with sporting inventory. During 3 years, city authorities, together with an NGO, carries out work with stray animals, and those animals are given later to people who want to take them after they are sterilized properly. So this is one of the most successful and most illustrative projects in cooperation of city authorities and NGOs, and very specific example. But it takes time for people to realize that their activity can influence over the decision-making process, over their lives. And that's why we support associations of different NGOs. We support people who try to organize themselves into some NGO to realize some specific projects.
Just a couple of comments on that. I think these most recent elections in Ukraine actually showed that it is worth taking part, and it is worth pushing forward with trying to make your vote a real vote, which is a kind of feeling that I hadn't sort of necessarily felt always before in Ukraine. That was just the kind of comment on the elections. In terms of NGOs in general, I mean, there are so many places in the post-Soviet space where actually even registering an NGO is very difficult. I'm thinking of Belarus. Azerbaijan is becoming increasingly difficult, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, where there are NGOs, but unless they're doing something that the government approves of, it's very difficult for them to get registered. I mean, of course, you can have sort of individual activity, but in the end, you really have to bring a group of people together under some sort of umbrella for that to be effective. And then, actually, even in the places where you can register NGOs and they can operate, and where you do have sort of civic action, you need some kind of minimal financing to have these efforts be more effective. And one way that many of these governments control the activities of civic groups is by controlling the flow of financing to them. They can't get funding typically from local businessmen or sources of funding internally, because the government will kind of prevent that. And now we've seen what's happened in Russia when there are quite a few of the sort of major NGOs receiving funding from abroad. A law has been passed to say that groups that are receiving this kind of funding have to register as foreign agents, which in Soviet speak means that they're spies. Just mentioning one kind of civic action that was worth looking at for sort of illustration of how it goes in Russia. I was thinking of the Khimki forest protection effort. A road was planned to run through the Khimki forest, which is just on the outskirts of Moscow. A group of sort of unconnected citizens came together to try and prevent that road from being built, but because the road was involved with the financial interests of some people close to Putin, there was a kind of battle about that. Also, some of the activists were sort of beaten up, and nasty things happened to them. And actually, the woman who started out being a sort of pro kind of ecological rights activist has ended up actually become very, very political, because sooner or later, all of those kinds of activities do run into some sort of brick wall where you have financial interests and political interests being the obstacle to having just simple civic activity. I'm not sure that civic activity exists in a sort of pure space ever. So that's something that we always need to keep in mind.
Thank you. I think we've run right about to the end of our time, so I think it may be a good moment to bring this to a close. I want to thank our three panelists for some very engaging conversations, also some very enlightening remarks, I think, that shed light on the topic that we wanted to cover here today. And we really appreciate, Mary, your coming the distance you did to give us the local perspective from the Ukraine. And Nadia, of yours at the larger national level, and Paul even at the more in the regional level there. So I think it was a great mix, and I think the conversation was excellent. And we appreciate very much your all being with us here today, and for your participation and the good questions that you asked. Thank you very much for being with us.